Beauty and the Beast is often remembered as the perfect Disney fairy tale. A cursed prince, an impossible romance, a magical castle, a glowing ballroom, and a song so beautiful that generations of children learn to associate it with the idea of happily ever after. But look closer and something far stranger emerges. This is not simply Disney's best animated fairy tale. It is a Broadway tragedy disguised as a children's movie, a story about mortality, isolation, fear, and transformation wearing the costume of a romantic fantasy. The most beautiful sequence in the entire film, the moment when Belle and the Beast glide beneath a golden chandelier while Alan Menken's orchestra rises around them, becomes almost unbearably poignant when you remember what was happening behind the scenes. Lyricist Howard Ashman, the creative force behind so much of the film's emotional identity, was seriously ill with AIDS-related complications while the movie was being written and produced. The man helping Disney rediscover the emotional power of musical storytelling was confronting his own mortality while creating a story obsessed with curses, fading time, isolation, and the desperate hope that something beautiful can survive before the final petal falls. That changes the way you hear the soundtrack. The rose is no longer simply a magical prop. The clock is no longer merely a plot device. The castle is not just a spooky setting. Everything feels like it is running out of time. And that urgency is part of what makes Beauty and the Beast feel so different from the fairy tales that came before it. Disney had already proven that animation could be funny, colorful, and commercially successful. But here the studio was attempting something far more ambitious. It wanted an animated musical to carry the dramatic architecture of Broadway, the emotional weight of a live-action prestige film, and the visual spectacle of a fantasy epic. Remarkably, it worked. Beauty and the Beast became the first animated feature ever nominated for the Academy Award for Best Picture, competing in a category traditionally reserved for the industry's most prestigious live-action productions. And it achieved that milestone without the fully digital animation pipelines that would later become standard. Its magic came from thousands of drawings, painted backgrounds, meticulous layouts, extraordinary draftsmanship, and artists making impossible movement feel effortless. The irony is almost perfect. A movie about a creature learning that humanity exists beneath appearances was itself underestimated because it was drawn. Yet beneath those drawings was one of the most sophisticated pieces of filmmaking Hollywood had produced. The fairy tale was polished. The production was chaotic. The imagery was warm. The circumstances were heartbreaking. And somewhere between those contradictions, Disney created something that still feels alive more than 3 decades later. Section 1.2, Video Roadmap. To understand why Beauty and the Beast remains so powerful, we have to stop treating it like a simple children's story and start examining it like a piece of cinema. Because almost every decision in this film is doing more than one job. The songs are not interruptions to the story. They are the story. The animation is not merely decoration. It externalizes psychology. The castle is not simply a location. It behaves like an extension of the Beast's emotional condition. Even the village, with its cheerful houses and familiar routines, becomes something more unsettling once we realize that Belle's greatest problem is not that she lives in a dangerous place. It is that she lives in a place where everyone expects her to become someone she does not want to be. This video will follow Beauty and the Beast from its origins through its cultural legacy. But the goal is not simply to retell what happens. We are going to break down why it happens, why the structure works, and why so many of its choices became foundational to modern animated storytelling. We will look at the film's transformation from a potentially conventional fairy tale adaptation into a full Broadway-style musical. We will examine how Howard Ashman and Alan Menken use songs to compress character development, introduce entire communities, accelerate emotional transitions, and make internal desires audible. We will look at Belle and the Beast not as a traditional damsel and savior, but as psychological mirrors. Both are isolated. Both feel misunderstood. Both are trapped by identities imposed upon them. And both have to confront the possibility that the person they thought they were becoming may not be the person they actually are. We will also examine Gaston, because his role becomes much more fascinating when we realize that Disney has deliberately given the traditional hero the soul of a villain, and given the apparent monster the capacity for empathy. We will explore the symbolism of the rose, the castle, the changing color palette, the stained glass prologue, and the final transformation. Then we will move behind the screen into the production itself, where hand-drawn animation, computer-assisted technology, cinematic staging, and Broadway orchestration were being combined in ways that changed what audiences expected from animation. And finally, we will confront the questions that have followed the film for decades. Does Belle's relationship with the Beast actually make sense? Is the Stockholm Syndrome criticism fair? Why does the story's transformation still feel emotionally convincing despite its fairy tale logic? And why does this particular movie continue to resonate in a culture increasingly obsessed with appearance, status, popularity, and instant validation? Because once you understand how Beauty and the Beast is constructed, you cannot really watch it the same way again. What looked like a simple fairy tale starts revealing itself as an extraordinarily precise machine for turning loneliness into connection. Section 1.3 Audience Connection. Most people do not remember their first encounter with Beauty and the Beast as a film. They remember it as a feeling. Maybe it was a VHS cassette pushed into a bulky television, the familiar Disney logo appearing before the room went quiet. Maybe it was the opening stained glass windows, each image presenting fragments of a forgotten legend, while the orchestra seemed to announce that something enormous had happened before the story even began. Or maybe it was simply the first time Belle appeared in her blue dress, walking through a village where everyone seemed to know exactly who she was supposed to become. At 6 years old, the movie can feel like a straightforward adventure. There is a princess-like heroine, a frightening beast, talking furniture, a villain who sings about himself, and a magical transformation at the end. The castle is scary but also exciting. The beast is frightening but also fascinating. The ballroom is beautiful, and the promise of romance seems obvious. Then you watch it at 25. Suddenly the story feels almost painfully different. You notice that Belle is lonely before she ever meets the Beast. You notice that the village laughs at the things she loves. You notice that Gaston is not simply arrogant. He is offended by the idea that Belle might have a future that does not revolve around him. You notice that the Beast's greatest enemy is not the curse itself, but his inability to communicate without turning fear into anger. You notice that the servants are not merely funny objects. They are people trapped inside a countdown, watching pieces of their humanity disappear. And you notice the rose. That rose is perhaps the most haunting object in the entire film because it turns time into something visible. Every petal that falls means the future is becoming smaller. This is why the movie can hit harder as an adult. Childhood sees the magic. Adulthood begins to see the cost. And yet, remarkably, the film does not become less beautiful once those darker meanings become visible. It becomes richer. The hand-drawn backgrounds still possess a tactile quality that modern digital animation often struggles to reproduce. The characters still move with the imperfections of human craftsmanship. The painted textures, theatrical lighting, and carefully composed silhouettes give the movie the feeling of an illustrated storybook that somehow learned how to breathe. Modern animation can create enormous worlds with astonishing realism, but Beauty and the Beast demonstrates something different. Permanence does not always come from realism. Sometimes it comes from style, composition, rhythm, and emotional clarity. The film looks old in the same way a great painting looks old. Its age is visible, but that age becomes part of its identity. And that may be the strangest achievement of all. A movie made in 1991 about a woman learning to see beyond appearances still feels relevant in an era when appearances have never been more powerful. We may have traded village gossip for social media feeds, painted portraits for filtered photographs, and physical status for digital validation, but the human temptation remains identical. Decide what someone is worth before discovering who they are. Beauty and the Beast understood that temptation 3 decades ago. That is why returning to it as an adult does not simply bring back childhood. It asks you to reconsider what you thought childhood was actually watching. Part 2. Context Background. Section 2.1 Production Origins. The strange thing about Beauty and the Beast is that Disney did not simply decide one morning to make a great fairy tale musical. The movie emerged from years of failed attempts, discarded ideas, creative uncertainty, and one of the most important course corrections in the history of American animation. The source material itself was not new. Jean-Marie Leprince de Beaumont's 18th-century fairy tale had already established the basic ingredients. A young woman, an enchanted monster, a father in danger, a castle, a curse, and the gradual discovery that appearances can conceal character. On paper, it sounded perfect for Disney. In practice, it was surprisingly difficult to turn into a feature film. Walt Disney Studio had considered the story as early as the 1930s, and later revisited it during the 1950s, but the same fundamental problem kept returning. A fairy tale about a woman gradually falling in love with a beast is emotionally intimate, but a feature film needs momentum. The characters cannot simply remain in a castle waiting for affection to develop. The story needs conflict, comic relief, musical energy, visual escalation, and a clear emotional progression. The challenge was not discovering what happened. The challenge was discovering how to make the audience care for two people trapped inside a story whose central relationship could easily become repetitive. Decades later, during Disney's renewed animation ambitions, the studio tried again. The initial approach was considerably darker and less musical. Director Richard Purdom worked on a version that treated the material more like a traditional dramatic fairy tale than the operatic musical it would eventually become. Artists produced substantial work, and roughly 20 minutes of animation had been developed, but the project was struggling to find a pulse. Jeffrey Katzenberg, then leading Walt Disney Feature Animation, recognized the problem. The film was not merely unfinished. It was fundamentally misconceived. So Disney did something that sounds almost reckless after the fact. It threw away much of the completed approach and started over. The timing could hardly have been more significant. The studio had just experienced the enormous success of The Little Mermaid, which had demonstrated that animated musicals could once again become major theatrical events. Behind that success were lyricist Howard Ashman and composer Alan Menken, two creators who understood something Disney desperately needed to rediscover. A musical number could do the work of several scenes if it was written with enough precision. Ashman and Menken were brought into Beauty and the Beast, and suddenly the project changed identity. Instead of asking how to make a fairy tale last 90 minutes, the filmmakers began asking how to build a Broadway musical inside an animated movie. That distinction transformed everything. Belle's introduction could become a large ensemble number rather than a sequence of ordinary conversations. Gaston could reveal his narcissism through a song that literally turns his ego into choreography. The enchanted servants could Be Our Guest to temporarily bury the horror of their situation beneath impossible spectacle. And the Beast could communicate feelings that he was incapable of expressing through dialogue, by allowing music, movement, and silence to speak for him. Directors Kirk Wise and Gary Truesdale joined the project, while story artists including Roger Allers helped reshape the dramatic structure. The production began to resemble a theatrical collaboration, rather than a conventional animated feature. The filmmakers were not simply illustrating a screenplay. They were designing performances. But there was a shadow over that creative transformation. Howard Ashman's health was deteriorating. He had been diagnosed with HIV and was living with AIDS-related illness while working on the movie. Rather than stepping away completely, he continued contributing to the project with extraordinary determination. Production meetings were moved to Fishkill, New York, allowing Ashman to remain closer to where he was receiving treatment and to participate despite his declining condition. This context matters because the emotional vocabulary of Beauty and the Beast is unusually preoccupied with things Ashman knew intimately: isolation, stigma, mortality, transformation, the fear of becoming someone others reject, and the desperate hope that compassion might arrive before time runs out. It would be too simplistic to claim that every element of the film is a direct autobiographical metaphor. The production was a huge collaborative effort, and the themes existed in the fairy tale long before Ashman touched the project. But his presence shaped the film's emotional language. He understood that the most powerful fantasy stories are often about very real fears. The Beast is cursed because he has been reduced to his appearance. Belle is isolated because she refuses to perform the identity her community expects. The servants are slowly losing their human forms. The rose is counting down toward permanent change. And beneath all of it is a creative team trying to make something extraordinary, while one of its central artists was confronting a terminal illness. That contradiction would become part of the film's soul. Beauty and the Beast was becoming more alive at precisely the moment when Ashman's own life was becoming more fragile. Section 2.2. Pre-release landscape. To understand why Beauty and the Beast mattered so much in 1991, it helps to remember what animation was fighting against. Today, an animated feature can dominate the cultural conversation before audiences even see it. In the early 1990s, animation was still frequently treated as a specialized form of entertainment, something primarily associated with children, family matinees, and seasonal releases. Disney had enormous historical prestige, but the studio had also spent years trying to prove that its animated division could once again create films that mattered commercially and artistically. The late 1980s had changed the equation. The Little Mermaid had arrived as a major success, and Disney was beginning to understand that animation could operate like Broadway, pop music, and blockbuster cinema simultaneously. But one successful film did not guarantee a renaissance. The industry still had competitors, changing audience expectations, and the lingering influence of Don Bluth's animated features. Disney needed to demonstrate that The Little Mermaid was not an isolated comeback. Beauty and the Beast therefore carried enormous expectations. The project was ambitious in ways that could easily have gone wrong. It was a romantic story centered on two characters whose relationship had to evolve convincingly. It was a musical containing several elaborate ensemble numbers. It required the audience to empathize with a protagonist whose face and body were designed to look frightening. It also demanded technical innovations capable of making the animation feel cinematic rather than stage-bound. Then Disney made another extraordinary decision. The studio showed unfinished material. At the 1991 New York Film Festival, audiences were presented with an incomplete version of Beauty and the Beast built substantially from storyboards, pencil tests, layouts, and rough animation rather than the polished final imagery audiences would eventually see. For a studio accustomed to protecting its expensive productions, this was a considerable gamble. If the unfinished footage failed, critics might conclude that the film itself was failing. Instead, the response was astonishing. The work-in-progress presentation received a lengthy standing ovation, widely remembered as a roughly 10-minute eruption of enthusiasm from the festival audience. The reaction mattered because it suggested that viewers were responding to the filmmaking itself rather than merely to polished animation. Even in rough form, the characters, songs, dramatic structure, and emotional timing were working. That distinction was revolutionary. Audiences were not applauding because the movie looked finished. They were applauding because the story already existed beneath the unfinished images. The screening effectively demonstrated that animation could command the same kind of attention traditionally given to prestige live-action cinema. Critics were beginning to discuss animated filmmaking in terms of direction, writing, music, character development, and cinematic technique, rather than treating the medium as an inferior category of entertainment. And the timing could not have been better. The studio was preparing to release a film that did not look like a children's product pretending to be sophisticated. It looked like a sophisticated film that happened to be animated. That difference would define the Disney Renaissance. Beauty and the Beast arrived at a moment when the industry was finally ready to reconsider what animation could accomplish. The question was no longer whether cartoons could entertain children. The question was whether animation could produce the same emotional complexity, cultural impact, and artistic ambition as the most respected forms of cinema. The unfinished festival screening offered an early answer. Yes. And once the finished film arrived, it would make that answer almost impossible to ignore. Part 3 Story Recap. Section 3.1. Act 1 Setup. Beauty and the Beast begins by refusing to start where a conventional fairy tale might. There is no cheerful village, no young heroine, and no promise of romance. Instead, the film begins with a warning. Through stained glass imagery and a solemn prologue, we learn about a prince who possessed wealth, beauty, and privilege but lacked compassion. When an old beggar woman offers him a rose in exchange for shelter, he rejects her because he judges her by appearance. The beggar reveals herself as an enchantress, and the prince's cruelty becomes the reason for his transformation. He is turned into a beast, his servants are transformed into enchanted objects, and a magical rose becomes a clock. If the beast cannot learn to love and receive love before the final petal falls, the curse will become permanent. This opening establishes the central contradiction immediately. The beast looks monstrous because he behaved monstrously, but the story does not tell us whether changing his appearance will change his character. The curse therefore functions as both punishment and opportunity. He has been given time to become human again, but time is precisely what he cannot control. Then the movie cuts from gothic darkness to sunlight. We meet Belle. She walks through a picturesque provincial town carrying a book, surrounded by villagers who immediately identify her as strange. The Belle sequence is one of the most efficient character introductions in animated cinema, because it does not merely introduce Belle. It introduces the entire social ecosystem that surrounds her. The townspeople see her as odd because she reads, dreams, and refuses to fit into the narrow expectations of her environment. Belle, meanwhile, sees the village as repetitive and limiting. Her famous desire is not initially romantic. She wants more. That distinction matters. Belle is not waiting for a prince to rescue her from ordinary life. She is already aware that the life being offered to her is too small. Her father Maurice is an eccentric inventor, and their relationship provides Belle with another source of separation from the community. She is not merely the strange girl who reads. She is the strange girl who belongs to a strange family. And then Gaston enters. If Belle represents curiosity, Gaston represents certainty. He is physically imposing, socially admired, and completely convinced that the world exists to confirm his superiority. The village sees him as a hero because he embodies the qualities they understand: strength, confidence, conventional masculinity, and social status. Belle sees something else. She sees a man who has no interest in learning anything that might challenge his assumptions. This makes Gaston her perfect antithesis. The first act therefore establishes two different kinds of imprisonment. Belle is trapped by a society that cannot understand her imagination. The Beast is trapped inside a body created by his own arrogance. One character wants to escape the boundaries imposed by her environment. The other must learn how to escape the boundaries he created within himself. Neither knows it yet, but their stories are moving toward the same place. Section 3.2. Act 1 Continued Call to Adventure. Maurice's journey into the forest begins as a simple mistake and quickly becomes a descent into another world. Lost in the darkness, surrounded by twisted trees and unfamiliar paths, he discovers the Beast's castle. The architecture is enormous, Gothic, and threatening. Its towers appear almost alive against the night sky. The castle feels less like a home than a physical manifestation of a damaged mind. Maurice enters because he is desperate for shelter. Instead, he becomes a prisoner. The Beast's reaction is immediate and violent. His world has been invaded, and rather than communicate fear or vulnerability, he responds with rage. Maurice is thrown into the dungeon, where the cold stone reinforces the sense that the castle is a prison designed for people who cannot leave. Belle arrives searching for her father. This is where the film makes one of its most important departures from the traditional passive fairy tale heroine. Belle does not accidentally stumble into danger and wait for someone to rescue her. She finds her father, understands that he is imprisoned, and makes a decision. She takes his place. It is an act of sacrifice, but more importantly, it is an act of agency. Belle chooses imprisonment because she values another person's life more than her own freedom. The Beast did not successfully capture her through manipulation. He captured Maurice, and Belle voluntarily crosses the threshold to save him. That distinction becomes essential to understanding their relationship later. The castle doors close behind her. From this point forward, the visual language changes. The open sunlit village gives way to narrow corridors, towering staircases, heavy shadows, and rooms filled with objects that seem to have personalities. Belle's world has literally become enclosed. But the castle is not simply a place of horror. It is a place where rules are beginning to break. The enchanted servants are desperate because they understand what Belle does not yet know. Her arrival may be their last chance. They have watched the rose lose petals. They know that if the curse remains, they will not simply continue living as furniture and household objects. Their human identities may disappear permanently. The beast, however, does not understand how close he is to losing everything. He only understands that he is afraid, and fear in him still comes out as anger. Belle initially rejects his demand for obedience, and the beast storms away. The relationship has not begun romantically. It begins as a confrontation between two people who have been stripped of control in different ways. Belle has lost her freedom. The beast has lost his humanity. Neither is ready to admit that the other might be capable of giving something back. Section 3.3. Act 2. Arising action. Life inside the castle begins with an uneasy contradiction. Belle has been imprisoned, but the servants desperately want her to feel welcome. The beast wants her to love him, but he does not yet understand how to behave like someone worthy of love. The enchanted objects therefore become mediators between two people who cannot communicate directly. And then comes Be Our Guest. On the surface, it is one of the most joyous musical sequences Disney ever created. Plates dance. Napkins spin. Candles become performers. Food explodes into choreography. Lumiere takes center stage while Cogsworth attempts to maintain some semblance of order. The entire castle seems to wake up. But underneath the spectacle is something darker. The servants are fighting for their lives. They know that Belle's presence could determine whether they remain human. Their enthusiasm is therefore both genuine and desperate. They are not simply entertaining a guest. They are trying to make the one person who might save them feel comfortable enough to stay. That tension gives the sequence its unusual emotional texture. The audience is allowed to enjoy the spectacle without being forced to confront the horror beneath it. But the horror never disappears. Belle, meanwhile, begins exploring the castle and gradually discovers that this strange environment contains spaces the beast does not want her to see. The West Wing becomes the physical embodiment of his shame. It is dark, damaged, and filled with evidence of the person he once was. The enchanted rose sits there under its glass dome, quietly counting down. Belle enters. The beast finds her. His reaction is explosive. He roars at her, frightening her into retreat. But the important thing is what happens next. Belle does not simply accept his anger because he is cursed. She leaves. She refuses to normalize his cruelty. This matters because the film does not present love as unlimited tolerance for abusive behavior. Belle's boundaries are part of the story. The beast must eventually learn that fear does not grant him the right to control another person. Belle flees into the snowy forest, where the castle's walls disappear behind her. For a moment she is free. And that is precisely when the beast is forced to make a choice. He could let her go. He could remain exactly as he is. Instead, when Belle is attacked by wolves, he follows her into danger. The relationship begins to change not because Belle suddenly finds him attractive, but because his behavior gives her something new to evaluate. He protects her. And more importantly, he is willing to suffer for her. The beast returns to the castle wounded, and Belle sees something that did not exist before. Vulnerability. The story has reached its first real turning point. Section 3.4. Act 2B Midpoint Crisis. The wolf attack changes the emotional mathematics of the story. Before that moment, Belle sees the beast primarily as a threat. After it, she begins to see the possibility of another person inside the monster. The transformation does not happen instantly. Instead, it happens through small choices. The beast has been given an opportunity to behave differently, and for perhaps the first time he does. Belle tends his wounds. The beast does not respond perfectly. Neither does Belle. But the relationship is no longer defined entirely by captivity and fear. It becomes a negotiation. They argue. They discover shared interests. The castle becomes less frightening. Belle begins to laugh. The beast begins to listen. This is where something there becomes so important. The song does not declare that the two characters are suddenly in love. It captures confusion. Belle is surprised that the person she feared is becoming someone she understands. The beast is surprised that kindness from another person does not feel like weakness. Their emotional movement is communicated through a montage of ordinary interactions, rather than a single dramatic declaration. That subtlety is one of the film's greatest strengths. Love grows through repetition, through noticing, through allowing another person to become more complicated than the first impression. Eventually, the relationship reaches the ballroom. The beast has prepared himself for the moment. Belle enters a room transformed by candlelight and grandeur, and the visual scale of the sequence reflects the emotional scale of their relationship. They are no longer simply prisoner and captor. They are two people occupying the same emotional space. The dance is beautiful precisely because it represents something fragile. For the first time, the beast behaves not as a creature demanding obedience, but as someone trying to make another person happy. Yet the movie refuses to end here. Belle still wants to see her father. When she realizes Maurice is in danger, she asks to leave. And the beast does something extraordinary. He lets her go. This is the ultimate test of his transformation because he knows what it means. If the curse requires love before the rose's final petal falls, allowing Belle to leave may destroy his chance. But he understands that keeping her captive would contradict the very thing he is supposed to learn. So he gives her freedom. True love, the movie argues, cannot be proven through possession. It is proven through release. The beast sacrifices his own chance at salvation because he values Belle's happiness more than his own desire to keep her. The irony is that this act is exactly what makes him worthy of love. Section 3.5. Act 3 Climax Resolution. While Belle returns to her father, Gaston has transformed his wounded pride into something far more dangerous. He cannot accept that Belle rejected him, and he cannot tolerate the possibility that she has chosen someone else. So he weaponizes the village's fear. The mob song is where the film's comedy turns into political horror. Gaston does not need evidence that the beast is dangerous. He only needs people to believe that danger exists. He describes an unknown creature living in the forest, frames the beast as a threat to their families, and turns uncertainty into panic. The villagers do not investigate. They follow. That is what makes the sequence so disturbing. Gaston's greatest weapon is not his strength. It is his ability to transform fear into collective action. The castle becomes the target. Belle realizes what is happening and races back. By the time she arrives, the beast has almost completely surrendered to despair. He believes Belle has abandoned him. He has been transformed physically by the curse, but now his emotional transformation seems to be collapsing. Gaston attacks. The battle across the castle towers becomes a confrontation between two different forms of masculinity. Gaston fights to dominate. The beast fights because he has something to lose. Earlier, the beast would have attacked from rage. Now he hesitates. He is capable of mercy. Gaston is not. That difference determines the outcome. The Beast gains the advantage but refuses to kill Gaston. He has finally learned restraint. Gaston responds by stabbing him. The Beast collapses, and for a moment the entire story appears to have failed. The rose loses its final petal. Belle arrives too late. She tells him she loves him. The spell breaks. The transformation that follows is often remembered as a magical reward, but its emotional meaning is more complicated. The Beast does not become human because Belle proves that appearances do not matter. He becomes human because the story has already demonstrated that his humanity was restored before his body changed. The physical transformation merely makes visible what has already happened internally. The monster was becoming human long before the magic revealed a prince. And Gaston, despite possessing the body, strength, and social position of the traditional fairy tale hero, remained monstrous because he never learned empathy. The final image therefore completes the argument established in the opening stained glass. Beauty was never the point. Humanity was. Part 4. Character Analysis. Section 4.1. Protagonist Deep Dive. Belle is one of Disney's most important heroines because her defining quality is not beauty, kindness, or romantic desirability. It is autonomy. She wants the right to determine what her life means, and almost every major decision she makes reflects that desire. From the beginning, Belle refuses the identity assigned to her. Her village expects women to behave according to familiar patterns, and Gaston assumes that Belle's beauty automatically makes her suitable for him. But Belle is not interested in being admired. She wants to understand the world. Books matter to her because they allow her to imagine lives beyond the boundaries of her own. Her intellectual curiosity is therefore not a decorative character trait. It is her survival mechanism. Reading gives Belle a psychological escape from a society that cannot satisfy her. The village is physically open, but emotionally restrictive. The castle is physically restrictive, but paradoxically becomes a place where Belle can finally explore ideas, relationships, and emotions without constantly being told what she should want. That inversion is crucial. Belle is not saved from confinement by romance. She discovers herself while navigating different forms of confinement. Her agency becomes even clearer once the story begins. She chooses to sacrifice herself for Maurice. She challenges the Beast when he behaves cruelly. She leaves the castle when she feels unsafe. She returns when she understands that he is in danger. She chooses to love him only after observing his behavior change. The plot happens because Belle makes decisions. That is remarkably different from the passive fairy tale structure, in which the heroine simply waits for events to happen around her. Belle's greatest transformation is therefore not physical. She does not become more beautiful, more socially acceptable, or more desirable. She becomes more emotionally perceptive. She learns that her initial judgment of the Beast was incomplete, just as the village's judgment of her was incomplete. This is why Belle and the Beast function as mirrors. Both are misread by their communities. Both are isolated. Both have learned defensive behaviors. Belle protects herself through intellectual distance. The Beast protects himself through aggression. Their relationship works because each gradually challenges the other's defense mechanism. Belle teaches the Beast that vulnerability does not equal weakness. The Beast teaches Belle that being understood can be more frightening and more meaningful than simply being left alone. Her rejection of Gaston also reinforces the same idea. Gaston offers everything the traditional fairy tale supposedly promises: strength, social status, physical attractiveness, confidence, and a comfortable domestic future. Belle rejects it because comfort without understanding is another form of imprisonment. That is what makes her revolutionary. She does not need a prince to validate her worth. She needs someone capable of seeing her as a complete person. And eventually she becomes capable of doing the same. Section 4.2. Antagonist Psychology. Gaston may be one of Disney's most brilliant villains precisely because he looks like a hero. If we stripped away the dialogue and judged the character according to traditional fairy tale imagery, Gaston would appear to be the obvious romantic lead. He is handsome, physically powerful, admired by the community, confident, and socially successful. He enters scenes like a man who expects the world to make room for him. The problem is that his confidence is not confidence at all. It is entitlement. Gaston believes that because he wants Belle, Belle should want him. Her rejection is therefore not interpreted as a legitimate choice. He experiences it as an insult. This is where his narcissism becomes dangerous. Gaston does not attempt to understand Belle. He attempts to defeat the version of Belle who refuses him. He treats her independence as a personal attack because her existence contradicts his worldview. His famous obsession with hunting functions symbolically as well. He sees nature as something to conquer, women as something to possess, and social status as something to reinforce his superiority. Everything becomes part of a hierarchy. He must be above. Someone else must be below. The Beast initially operates according to a similar logic. That is why the two characters are more alike than they appear. Both believe power gives them the right to control others. The difference is that the Beast is capable of changing. Gaston is not. As the story progresses, his comedy becomes increasingly sinister. His obsession moves from unwanted courtship to manipulation, then to violence. He recruits the villagers by exploiting their fear, transforming personal rejection into collective hatred. This is where Gaston stops being merely a narcissistic comic villain and becomes a political figure. He creates an enemy. He tells people that the enemy threatens their families. He promises to lead them against it. The logic is simple because fear is simple. The Beast is dangerous because he is different. That is all Gaston needs. His final confrontation with the Beast therefore becomes more than hero versus villain. It becomes appearance versus character. Gaston looks like the traditional hero but behaves like a monster. The Beast looks like the traditional monster but has learned restraint. And that inversion is the film's most important trick. Gaston does not fail because he is physically weaker. He fails because he never changes. The Beast survives because he does. Section 4.3. Supporting Cast Dynamics. The enchanted servants are often remembered as the funniest characters in Beauty and the Beast, but their deeper function is considerably more tragic. Lumiere, Cogsworth, Mrs. Potts, and the other servants represent the human life trapped inside the curse. They are living evidence that the Beast's transformation has consequences beyond his own suffering. Lumiere is instinctive, romantic, and energetic. He approaches problems through passion. Cogsworth is cautious, rule-oriented, and anxious about maintaining order. Their arguments are funny, but they also create a psychological balance around the Beast. Lumiere encourages emotional risk. Cogsworth fears the consequences. In a sense, they externalize two competing forces within the Beast himself. One side wants connection. The other fears losing control. Mrs. Potts provides something different. She is the emotional center of the castle, maternal without being sentimental. Her voice carries warmth, patience, and reassurance. When she sings Beauty and the Beast, the song feels less like a romantic prediction and more like an observation from someone who has watched two wounded people slowly stop being afraid of one another. Chip, meanwhile, represents innocence and future possibility. His small presence reminds us that the curse does not only threaten the adults. Even the youngest members of the household are running out of time. That is what makes the curse so devastating when examined closely. The servants did not create it. They are collateral damage. They are losing their humanity because of someone else's mistake. The longer the story continues, the more the enchanted objects resemble a ticking clock. Their bodies are already becoming objects, and eventually the transition may become permanent. A servant who was once human becomes furniture. A person becomes an ornament. A life becomes an object that can be moved, broken, or forgotten. The film rarely stops to explain the horror of this because it hides it inside comedy. That is one of the story's recurring techniques. The brighter the castle becomes, the darker its circumstances can feel. The servants joke because they are afraid. They sing because time is running out. They celebrate Belle because they may be watching their final opportunity to become human again. Their optimism is therefore not naive. It is desperate. And when the curse finally breaks, the transformation is emotionally satisfying, partly because we are not simply watching the beast regain his humanity. We are watching an entire household receive its life back. The castle has been waiting for this moment as long as the beast has. The people surrounding him were never merely side characters. They were the witnesses to his transformation. Part 5, Theme Symbolism. Section 5.1, Core Themes. The central theme of Beauty and the Beast is obvious enough to appear in the title. Beauty and monstrosity are not the same thing. But the film's achievement is that it does not merely state this idea. It builds the entire narrative around testing it from multiple directions. The beast looks monstrous but develops empathy. Gaston looks heroic but becomes cruel. Belle is considered strange despite possessing the emotional intelligence that eventually saves everyone. The village considers itself civilized while preparing to destroy something it does not understand. The film therefore asks a deceptively simple question. Who is actually the monster? The answer keeps changing depending on whether we judge people by appearance or behavior. Isolation is another major theme. Belle is isolated socially because she does not conform. The beast is isolated physically because he has been cursed. Yet both forms of isolation create opportunities for self-discovery. Belle's loneliness pushes her toward books and imagination. The beast's loneliness eventually forces him to confront himself. The castle becomes a strange laboratory for emotional growth. Outside, everyone already knows who Belle and Gaston are supposed to be. Inside, those identities become unstable. The story's idea of love is equally important. Genuine love requires sacrifice because it values another person's freedom. Possessive desire does the opposite. Gaston wants Belle because she would confirm his status. The beast initially wants Belle because he believes her love will save him. Both motivations are self-centered. Only later does the beast learn to release her. That is the moment love becomes real. He stops asking what Belle can do for him and starts asking what she needs. The transformation is therefore not caused by romance alone. It is caused by empathy. And that distinction is what allows the fairy tale to become something deeper than a story about finding the right person. It becomes a story about becoming the kind of person who can love another person without owning them. Section 5.2, Visual Symbolism. Few animated films use visual symbolism as consistently as Beauty and the Beast. The Enchanted Rose is the clearest example. It functions as a biological hourglass, connecting beauty, youth, time, and mortality in one image. A rose naturally blooms and dies. The cursed rose does the same thing, except its petals become a countdown. Every falling petal reminds us that beauty is temporary. The beast is not simply racing toward a romantic deadline. He is racing against the possibility that change will eventually become impossible. The film's color palette reinforces this symbolism. Belle is frequently associated with blue, a color that separates her from the warm earth tones of the village. The villagers blend into their environment. Belle stands apart. Later, when the Beast wears blue during the ballroom sequence, the visual language subtly aligns him with Belle. They are no longer presented as opposing figures. They are occupying the same emotional world. The village and castle also function as visual opposites. The village is composed of rounded, organic shapes, bright daylight, and familiar architecture. It appears safe because it is recognizable. The castle is full of vertical lines, sharp angles, dark corridors, gargoyles, and enormous spaces. Yet the apparent safe place contains Gaston. The frightening place contains the people capable of genuine transformation. That reversal prevents the visual design from becoming a simple good versus evil code. Even the gargoyles contribute to this psychological architecture. Their distorted faces and grotesque expressions echo the Beast's internal torment. The castle looks monstrous because the Beast feels monstrous. As his emotional state changes, the environment becomes warmer. The visual world is therefore not static. It responds to character. That is one reason the film feels cinematic rather than merely illustrated. The setting is always telling us something the dialogue does not. Section 5.3 Deeper Meanings. The deepest interpretation of beauty and the Beast emerges when we place the film beside Howard Ashman's personal circumstances. The Curse can be read as an allegory for terminal illness and social exile, particularly in the context of the AIDS crisis that shaped the late 1980s and early 1990s. The comparison should not be treated as a literal one-to-one explanation for every story element. The fairy tale predates Ashman by centuries, but the emotional parallels are difficult to ignore. A person becomes visibly different. Others respond with fear. The individual is isolated. Time becomes precious. The possibility of transformation hangs over everything. And the question becomes whether people will judge a person by what they see or by who that person actually is. Ashman was creating this material while confronting an illness surrounded by enormous public fear and stigma. That context inevitably gives certain images additional emotional weight. The Beast is not only afraid of dying, he is afraid of being seen. The mob song pushes the theme outward, showing what happens when fear becomes communal. Gaston turns uncertainty into certainty, difference into danger, and prejudice into action. The villagers do not know the Beast. They know the story Gaston tells them about the Beast. That distinction remains painfully relevant. The film's final philosophical question is therefore not simply whether the Beast can become human again. It is whether humanity was ever located in his physical form to begin with. If empathy can exist inside a monstrous body, and cruelty can exist inside a handsome one, then the body cannot be the final measure of humanity. The real transformation is internal. The spell merely makes it visible. Part 6 Production Breakdown. Section 6.1 Animation Visual Effects. The Beast could easily have become one of the most ridiculous characters in Disney history. A human body combined with multiple animals can quickly turn into a visual compromise, something that looks assembled rather than alive. Glenn Keane solved the problem by approaching the character as a creature with coherent anatomy, rather than a collection of random traits. The design combines elements associated with a lion, buffalo, gorilla, wild boar, bear, and other animals, but the key was not simply choosing recognizable features. The animators needed the Beast to possess weight, movement, and emotional readability. He had to be terrifying from a distance and vulnerable in close-up. His eyes needed to communicate intelligence. His hands needed to express gentleness despite their enormous size. His body needed to move like an animal, while still suggesting the posture of a human being trapped inside it. That contradiction required extraordinary draftsmanship. The animation became especially challenging during the ballroom sequence. The camera sweeps through the enormous room while Belle and the Beast move through a complex three-dimensional environment. The filmmakers used computer-generated techniques to create the ballroom's depth and camera movement, then integrated hand-drawn characters into that space. The effect was revolutionary because the camera no longer felt limited to the flat planes traditionally associated with hand-drawn animation. Could move. It could descend. Could sweep around characters. It could create the feeling of a live-action crane shot, while the performers themselves remain drawings. That combination is why the ballroom sequence still feels astonishing. The technology is visible, but it never becomes the point. The computer is used to support the emotional staging, rather than replace the artistic identity of the animation. Even the fabric required enormous effort. Belle's dress, the Beast's formal clothing, and the movement of their bodies during the dance had to be carefully coordinated. A single gesture could affect dozens of drawings. Modern digital animation can simulate cloth, lighting, and camera movement with sophisticated software. But in Beauty and the Beast, artists had to understand those things through observation, drawing, timing, and repeated correction. The result feels organic. The technology disappears. And that is often the mark of great visual effects. You notice the emotion, not the machinery. Section 6.2 Directorial Vision. Kirk Wise and Gary Truesdale approached Beauty and the Beast less like a traditional cartoon and more like a live-action dramatic feature that happened to be animated. That philosophy can be felt in almost every major sequence. The camera does not simply observe. It participates. Low angles make the Beast appear enormous. Sweeping movements create grandeur. Tight framing isolates characters when they become emotionally vulnerable. The filmmakers understood that animation could use cinematic grammar just as effectively as live-action cinema. The pacing is equally ambitious. A Broadway musical can stop the plot for a song and still maintain momentum because the song itself advances character. Beauty and the Beast adopts that principle. Belle introduces the social world. Gaston deepens the villain. Be Our Guest temporarily transforms the castle. Something there compresses emotional development. Beauty and the Beast crystallizes the relationship. Each number performs narrative work. The Gothic atmosphere also had to coexist with comedy. The castle could not become so frightening that children felt excluded, but it could not become so cute that the Beast lost his sense of danger. The directors constantly balance these tones. That balance is particularly difficult because comedy can destroy tension if inserted carelessly. Here, the enchanted servants provide relief without completely erasing the underlying threat. Storyboarding was therefore crucial. The filmmakers repeatedly revised sequences to ensure that character beats landed before spectacle. A joke could be spectacular, but if it did not reveal personality, it was less valuable. A dramatic moment could be visually beautiful, but if the audience did not understand why the character was making a decision, the beauty would not matter. That philosophy explains why the film still feels coherent despite its enormous number of moving parts. The directors were not simply creating memorable moments. They were building a chain of emotional consequences. Every major sequence changes how we understand someone. And that is what turns a collection of spectacular scenes into a movie. Part 7 Music Sound. Section 7.1 Musical Score Analysis. Alan Menken's score is one of the reasons Beauty and the Beast feels larger than its running time. The music does not merely accompany the action. It creates an emotional architecture beneath the dialogue. The opening prologue establishes a sound associated with the curse, creating an atmosphere that feels ancient and mournful. The orchestration carries echoes of classical traditions, including textures reminiscent of Saint-Saëns and the mysterious aquatic atmosphere associated with Aquarium from the Carnival of the Animals. But the score quickly develops its own identity. Belle's musical world is more lyrical and restless. Gaston receives broader, more theatrical musical language. The Beast is often surrounded by darker orchestral colors. The romantic material gradually becomes warmer as the characters become more emotionally open. These recurring musical ideas function like leitmotifs in opera or film scoring. Even when characters are not singing, the music can remind us of the emotional states associated with them. That is particularly important because Beauty and the Beast moves between musical numbers and dramatic scenes without feeling like two separate forms of storytelling. The score creates continuity. The film can move from classical elegance to French cabaret, from comic Broadway energy to operatic drama, and then into intimate romantic orchestration without losing its identity. Mencken's achievement is that these styles do not feel pasted together. They feel like different rooms inside the same musical house. The music also understands when to become quiet. Some of the most powerful moments are not enormous songs, but restrained passages where the orchestra gives the characters space to breathe. This is especially important around the Beast, whose emotional transformation is often communicated through music before his dialogue catches up. The score ultimately does what the story itself does. It turns internal change into something the audience can hear. Section 7.2. Song Sound Design. Howard Ashman's lyrics are deceptively precise. They often sound effortless because the rhymes are so natural, but underneath that accessibility is extraordinary structural discipline. Gaston does not simply tell us that Gaston is arrogant. It builds a complete mythology around him, allowing the character to become the narrator of his own exaggerated legend. Be-Our Guest does something similar for the servants. It introduces their personalities, their desperation, their enthusiasm, and their desire to reclaim the castle's hospitality through a single enormous theatrical number. Ashman's greatest strength is compression. He can communicate information through rhythm, repetition, rhyme, and character voice faster than ordinary dialogue could. The emotional centerpiece is Beauty and the Beast, performed by Angela Lansbury as Mrs. Potts. Lansbury's vocal performance carries an extraordinary sense of age and wisdom. She sounds as though she is witnessing something she knows the characters themselves cannot yet fully understand. The song's emotional power comes from restraint. It does not need to announce that Belle and the Beast are in love. It observes that something has changed. The sound design reinforces the physical identity of the castle. The Beast's roar has weight. His footsteps feel heavy. The enchanted servants produce mechanical clicks, metallic movement, ceramic sounds, and other details that remind us that they are simultaneously alive and transformed. That contradiction becomes audible. A teacup can speak, but it still sounds like porcelain. A candelabra can perform, but its metal arms still move with mechanical weight. The soundscape, therefore, keeps the fantasy grounded. The audience never completely forgets that these characters have been transformed into objects, and that makes their eventual return to human form more satisfying. Part 8. Cultural Impact. Section 8.1. Immediate Reception. When Beauty and the Beast arrived in November 1991, it did more than succeed. It changed the perceived ceiling of animated cinema. The film became a major commercial event, ultimately becoming the first animated feature to pass 100 million domestically during its initial theatrical run. More importantly, critics did not treat its success as a children's phenomenon that happened to make money. They treated the film as serious filmmaking. That distinction was revolutionary. High-profile critics such as Roger Ebert and Gene Siskel approached the movie with the same seriousness they might apply to live-action productions. The animation was discussed in terms of direction, storytelling, music, cinematography, and character development. Audiences responded just as strongly. The soundtrack became a cultural phenomenon. The songs escaped the movie and entered the broader musical landscape. Characters became instantly recognizable. Merchandise spread through homes, stores, television advertising, and children's bedrooms. But the most important product was not a toy. It was expectation. Audiences began expecting animated movies to provide emotional sophistication, rather than merely colorful entertainment. Adults could attend without feeling that they were simply accompanying children. The film could entertain a 6-year-old with dancing dishes while simultaneously engaging an adult with themes of mortality, isolation, social conformity, and prejudice. That dual audience became one of the defining characteristics of the Disney Renaissance. Beauty and the Beast proved that animation did not have to choose between artistic ambition and commercial accessibility. Could have both. Section 8.2, Long-term influence. The success of Beauty and the Beast helped establish the formula that would define the peak years of the Disney Renaissance. Strong character writing, Broadway-caliber music, theatrical spectacle, comedy for children, emotional subtext for adults, and merchandising potential could coexist inside a single animated feature. The movie also helped Disney understand that its stories could exist beyond the cinema. The Broadway adaptation became a major milestone, eventually helping establish Disney theatrical productions as a significant force in stage entertainment. The transition from animation to live theater was not simply a business expansion. It demonstrated how completely the film had been constructed around theatrical principles. The songs already behaved like stage numbers. The characters already had clear entrances and exits. The story already understood spectacle as performance. Beauty and the Beast therefore became a bridge between two entertainment industries. Its influence also spread generationally. For children growing up in the 1990s, the movie became part of the emotional architecture of childhood. But unlike many nostalgic artifacts, it survived because the themes remained accessible to adults. The story's fundamental questions never became outdated. What makes someone worthy of love? Can people change? How much does society determine who we become? What happens when fear replaces understanding? These questions allowed Beauty and the Beast to become more than a successful Disney movie. It became a reference point. Later animated films could imitate its musical structure, its character archetypes, its comic side characters, or its emotional climax. But the original remained unusually difficult to duplicate because its parts were so tightly integrated. The movie did not simply have memorable songs and beautiful animation. The songs, animation, characters, and themes were all telling the same story. Part 9. Critical Analysis. Section 9.1. Critics versus Audience. One of the most remarkable things about Beauty and the Beast is how little separation existed between critical enthusiasm and audience enthusiasm. Often, a film can become popular while critics remain skeptical, or critics can celebrate a movie that mainstream viewers find inaccessible. Beauty and the Beast largely avoided that divide. The reason is structural. The film rewards different kinds of attention. A child can enjoy the talking objects, comedy, action, songs, and transformation. A teenager can connect with Belle's feeling of being misunderstood. An adult can notice the psychological dynamics, mortality symbolism, social conformity, and production history. A film scholar can analyze the use of color, musical structure, camera movement, and genre inversion. Everyone is watching the same movie, but everyone can find a different level. That is a rare form of accessibility. The movie also gave adults permission to take animation seriously. Instead of requiring audiences to lower their expectations because the characters were drawn, it invited them to raise them. The small disagreements that exist among viewers tend to concern interpretation rather than execution. Some audiences emphasize the romance. Others focus on the social allegory. Some see the Beast primarily as a victim of his own arrogance, while others emphasize the troubling circumstances of the relationship. But the broad consensus remains surprisingly stable. The film works. And it works because the emotional logic beneath the fantasy is unusually coherent. Section 9.2. Controversies, criticisms. Modern discussions of Beauty and the Beast often revolve around one phrase: Stockholm Syndrome. The argument is that Belle falls in love with her captor because prolonged captivity creates an unhealthy psychological attachment. The criticism sounds persuasive when the story is reduced to its most basic premise. A woman is imprisoned by a beast and eventually falls in love with him. But the actual film is more complicated. Belle repeatedly resists the beast. She refuses to obey his demands. She challenges his behavior. She leaves when he becomes threatening. Most importantly, the beast eventually gives her the opportunity to leave, and she does. Her feelings develop after his behavior changes. That does not make the relationship psychologically perfect, nor does it erase the uncomfortable premise of captivity. But it does mean the Stockholm Syndrome label cannot fully explain the narrative. A more productive criticism concerns pacing. The film moves from hostility to affection relatively quickly. In real life, emotional transformation under circumstances this extreme would be far more complicated. The fairy tale structure compresses time because the movie is less interested in depicting a realistic courtship than in dramatizing the process of mutual transformation. There is also an interesting tension in the ending. Belle loves the beast as a beast, yet the curse ultimately transforms him into a conventionally handsome prince. Some viewers argue that this weakens the film's message about loving inner character. But the story's emotional climax occurs before the physical transformation. Belle declares her love while he is still a beast. The magic changes his body afterward. That sequencing matters. The film can therefore be read as saying that the transformation of appearance is merely the final visual confirmation of a transformation that has already happened internally. The criticism is worth discussing, but it does not erase the sophistication of the story's central argument. Part 10. Industry Impact. Section 10.1 Box Office Business. Beauty and the Beast demonstrated that ambitious animation could function as premium entertainment. Produced on a substantial budget for its era, the film went on to generate enormous theatrical revenue, with worldwide earnings eventually exceeding hundreds of millions of dollars across releases and reissues. But theatrical success was only part of the business story. The film became an enormous home video property, helping reinforce Disney's strategy of treating its animated catalog as a long-term library rather than a collection of disposable releases. VHS sales transformed successful theatrical films into recurring commercial assets. The implications were significant. Animation could now justify large budgets because the revenue did not stop when the theatrical run ended. A successful film could generate soundtrack sales, merchandise, home video purchases, television exposure, licensing opportunities, theme park relevance, and future re-releases. Beauty and the Beast proved that artistic ambition could actually strengthen the business model. The movie did not succeed despite being sophisticated. Its sophistication became part of the product's value. That created a precedent that would influence how studios evaluated animated projects throughout the decade. Section 10.2 Franchise Studio Impact. The success of Beauty and the Beast gave Disney executives confidence to invest heavily in animation. Projects that might previously have appeared too expensive or ambitious became easier to justify. The studio was no longer simply maintaining an animation department. It was building a franchise engine. The confidence created by the Renaissance helped support increasingly ambitious productions. including The Lion King and Pocahontas. Each new project carried expectations that animated films could become major cultural events. Competitors noticed. Other studios began pursuing prestige animated features, investing in stronger music, larger casts, advanced technology, and more cinematic storytelling. Beauty and the Beast also helped establish the idea that a successful animated property could continue beyond one film through sequels, television projects, stage adaptations, merchandise, and eventually live-action reinterpretations. Decades later, the 2017 live-action adaptation demonstrated how durable the original's commercial identity had become. But the most important impact was psychological. Disney now knew that audiences would show up for animation when the story was strong enough. And the rest of Hollywood had to accept that animation was no longer merely a genre for children. It was an industry. Part 11 Legacy. Section 11.1. Historical Significance. Beauty and the Beast made history when it became the first animated feature nominated for the Academy Award for Best Picture. At the 64th Academy Awards, it stood alongside major live-action productions, including The Silence of the Lambs and JFK. The nomination mattered beyond the award itself. It changed the category in which animation existed within Hollywood's imagination. For decades, animated films had been treated as specialized entertainment. Suddenly, one was being considered alongside major dramatic achievements in filmmaking. The film did not win Best Picture, but its nomination established a precedent. The Academy would eventually create a dedicated Best Animated Feature category, giving animation a formal competitive space of its own. There is an irony in that development. The Best Picture nomination was proof that animation could compete directly with live action. The later animated category was proof that animation had become too important to remain invisible. Beauty and the Beast helped force that conversation. Its historical importance was reinforced when the Library of Congress selected the film for preservation in the National Film Registry, recognizing it as culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant. That preservation is appropriate because the film is more than a successful Disney property. It documents a moment when American animation changed direction. Section 11.2 Timeless versus Dated. One of the most interesting questions about Beauty and the Beast is why it often feels less visually dated than some early computer-generated films released later in the decade. The answer is partly material. Hand-drawn animation does not attempt to reproduce reality. It creates an artistic reality. Painted backgrounds, stylized characters, deliberate lighting, and carefully controlled shapes produce an image that feels closer to illustration than simulation. Because the movie never promised photorealism, its visual style does not become obsolete simply because technology improves. A 1991 drawing does not compete with a 2026 rendering on the same terms. It competes on composition, and composition ages differently. The themes have also remained remarkably relevant. Belle's struggle with social judgment feels particularly contemporary in an age of constant public evaluation. The village's obsession with status and conformity resembles the social pressure of digital communities. Gaston's need for admiration feels almost painfully recognizable in a culture built around public validation. The film's central question remains unchanged. What happens when we decide who someone is before knowing them? That question will probably remain relevant as long as people continue judging one another. Beauty and the Beast survives because its nostalgia is attached to something deeper than childhood memory. It is attached to recognition. We remember the movie because some part of us still understands what it means to feel misunderstood.